Somewhere in ancient Alexandria, a ship pulled into harbor. Before it could dock, officials boarded, seized every scroll on board, and copied them, word for word, before returning the copies to the owners and keeping the originals for themselves. This wasn't theft. This was policy. Welcome to the Library of Alexandria, the most ambitious knowledge project the ancient world ever attempted, and the story of how it slowly, tragically, came apart. In the early 3rd century BCE, Alexandria was a new city, founded by Alexander the Great, ruled after his death by his general Ptolemy, and hungry to become the intellectual center of the world. Ptolemy, and later his son Ptolemy II, didn't just want a library. They wanted everything ever written in one building. So they built a machine for acquiring knowledge. Ships docking in Alexandria's harbor had their books confiscated and copied. Scholars were paid to travel the Mediterranean buying manuscripts. At one point, the library reportedly borrowed the official state copies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides from Athens, put up a massive cash deposit as collateral, and then simply forfeited the deposit and kept the originals, sending copies back instead. Athens got copies. Alexandria kept the real thing. Within decades, the library held what ancient sources estimate as hundreds of thousands of scrolls, by far the largest collection of written knowledge that had ever existed in one place. And the library didn't just store knowledge, it manufactured it. Euclid worked in Alexandria, and the geometry he wrote there, Elements, would be the standard math textbook for the next 2,000 years. Eratosthenes, the library's head librarian, used shadows cast at different Egyptian cities on the same day to calculate the circumference of the Earth. And he got it right to within a small margin of error, using nothing but geometry and a well. Archimedes studied in Alexandria before returning to Syracuse. Herophilus performed some of the first documented human dissections in history there, mapping the nervous system and the brain in ways that wouldn't be matched again for over 1,000 years. This wasn't a dusty archive. It was the world's first real research institution. Scholars lived on site, were paid a salary by the state, and had one job: push human knowledge forward. For roughly 2 centuries, Alexandria was, without much competition, the smartest city on Earth. Then, in 48 BCE, everything nearly ended in an afternoon. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria, chasing his rival Pompey, and found himself pulled into a local civil war between the Egyptian pharaoh and his sister, Cleopatra. Caesar's forces were outnumbered and cornered near the harbor. To stop the enemy fleet from trapping him, Caesar ordered the ships in the harbor set on fire. The fire spread. Ancient historians, including Plutarch, writing generations later, record that the flames reached the docks and warehouses along the waterfront and burned a significant number of scrolls stored there. Here's a critical, honest detail. Historians still debate how much was actually lost. Some ancient sources describe it as a catastrophic blow to the library itself. Others suggest what burned was mainly a warehouse of scrolls awaiting export or storage, not the main library building, which appears to have continued operating for centuries afterward. Either way, it was a warning. The library had survived, but its vulnerability was now obvious. What happened next wasn't a single dramatic collapse. It was worse, a slow bleeding out over 4 centuries. And this is the part most documentaries skip. but it's the real story. As Rome absorbed Egypt and the broader Mediterranean world, Alexandria's political importance shifted. State funding for scholarship wasn't guaranteed the way it had been under the Ptolemies. Some ancient writers describe scholars being persecuted or driven out during periods of political unrest. The famous mathematician and philosopher Hypatia, one of the last great minds associated with Alexandria's intellectual tradition, was murdered by a mob in 415 CE amid religious and political conflict gripping the city. Her death wasn't about the library directly, but it's a grim marker of how dangerous Alexandria's intellectual life had become by the 5th century. By this point, the library wasn't one building anymore. Its most important daughter institution was housed at the Serapeum, a temple complex that had absorbed much of the library's remaining collection over the centuries. And in 391 CE, that daughter library met its actual, well-documented end. The Roman Empire had by then adopted Christianity as its state religion, and tensions between Christian authorities and remaining pagan institutions in Alexandria boiled over. The Serapeum, a temple to the god Serapis that also housed scrolls, was a prime target. Under the direction of the Christian bishop Theophilus, and with the backing of an imperial decree targeting pagan temples, a mob destroyed the Serapeum. This event is far better documented than Caesar's fire. Multiple ancient historians describe the temple's destruction directly. What's genuinely uncertain is how many scrolls were still housed there at the time. By 391 CE, some of the collection may have already been dispersed, damaged, or lost through the centuries of decline that preceded it. There's a third destruction story you've likely heard, that Muslim armies burned the library in 642 CE when Alexandria fell during the Arab conquest of Egypt, supposedly on the order of a caliph who reasoned that if the books agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they disagreed, they were dangerous. Here's the honest problem with that story. It comes from a single source, a Christian bishop named Bar Hebraeus, writing roughly 600 years after the events supposedly happened. No earlier historian, Muslim or Christian, writing closer to the actual conquest, mentions it. Most modern historians treat it as a later legend, not a documented event. By 642 CE, the Great Library as an institution had almost certainly already ceased to exist in any significant form, worn away by the centuries of decline that came before. So what really happened to the Library of Alexandria? Not one fire, not one villain. A machine built for acquiring knowledge slowly lost the political will, funding, and safety that had let it operate. And two real, documented acts of destruction, decades apart, finished off what neglect had already weakened. We'll never know exactly what was lost. Ancient writers reference works, lost plays, lost mathematical treatises, lost histories, that we know existed only because later authors quoted them before they too vanished. Entire branches of ancient scholarship exist for us now only as fragments and footnotes. The Library of Alexandria wasn't destroyed by ignorance or fanaticism alone. It was destroyed by an accumulation of ordinary human failures. Funding cut here, protection withdrawn there, an afternoon of war that got out of hand, a mob that went further than anyone planned. That's a harder, less satisfying story than one dramatic burning, but it might be the more important one, because it means a civilization doesn't need a villain to lose its knowledge. It just needs to stop protecting it. So here's the question worth sitting with. How much of what we know today exists only because someone, somewhere, chose to preserve it? And how much are we one funding cut, one conflict, or one act of neglect away from losing all over again?